Hi everyone, so we're going to go ahead and continue with video 2, which is going to be the overview of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis occurs in 2 stages, and in layman's terms we refer to these stages as the light reactions and the dark reactions. But obviously they have more scientific terms than that. So the first stage, which is known as the photosynthetic electron transfer stage, in other words, the light reaction or the light dependent reaction. In this stage, sunlight is the energy that we're using, and sunlight will energize an electron in the green pigment called chlorophyll. And this electron that we're getting is obtained from the splitting of a water molecule. Okay, so sunlight energizes an electron that we get from the splitting of water in the green pigment called chlorophyll. And this enables the electron to move along the electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane. The chlorophyll will get this electron, like I said, from splitting water and then producing oxygen as a byproduct. During the electron transport chain in the thylakoid membrane, the hydrogen ions are pumped across the thylakoid membrane, and this electrochemical proton gradient will drive the synthesis of ATP in the stroma. So in other words, this is very similar to the electron transport chain in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it's also very similar to chemiosmosis in the mitochondrion. So finally, high energy electrons with the hydrogen protons are loaded onto NADP+, which is our final electron acceptor, just like the final electron acceptor in the mitochondrion is oxygen. In the chloroplast, it is NADP+. Okay, so then we reduce NADP+ into NADPH. Okay, so this is the part of the chloroplast that we're talking about, right? Each one of these little green stacks are your thylakoids surrounded by the thylakoid membrane, and then this whole stack is a granum. So the light comes in, and we will, go over at the molecular level what's happening. But the light comes in as well as water from the environment. The water gets split up into oxygen as a byproduct, and then the hydrogen protons and the electrons, and then those electrons along with the light get excited in the chlorophyll, and then they pass through a series of different proteins down in the thylakoid membrane until eventually we reduce NAD+ into NADPH, and then because we're also using the process of chemiosmosis, we're also making ATP, so we will also produce ATP as well. And then those 2 energy sources we will use for the Calvin cycle. So the second stage is our Calvin cycle. We can also refer to it as the carbon fixation reaction, or, the dark reaction, I would not say that, but that's ultimately how you can think about it as. So we would say the light independent reaction, okay, or the carbon fixation reaction, or the Calvin cycle. So in the second stage, we have ATP and NADPH that are produced by the light dependent reactions, and those will serve as the energy source to drive the conversion of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into carbohydrates, and that would be in the form of G3P, and then ultimately in the form of sucrose. Okay, so the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, and it will also then continue on into the cytosol, because remember, photosynthesis is one organelle, and that organelle is in the cell as a whole. Okay, so then these reactions produce sucrose as the major form of carbohydrate in the leaves of the plant, and then the sucrose is then exported to other tissues as a source for growth. So if we go back to our diagram, right, our ATP and our NADPH that are made from the light dependent reactions are then used in the Calvin cycle as its energy source. So, misconception is, oh, the Calvin cycle doesn't need energy. The light dependent reactions are the only ones that need energy, and that's not true. So the light dependent reactions, they need their energy in the form of sunlight, but Calvin cycle still needs energy, and it needs it in the form of ATP and NADPH. Okay, so ultimately, the Calvin cycle indirectly needs the light as well. So these energy sources are then brought into the Calvin cycle, which is in the stroma of the chloroplast, and the Calvin cycle will take in the CO2 through that stomata of the leaf, and then we'll go through 3 rounds of the Calvin cycle and ultimately produce the sucrose, so sugar in the form of sucrose that will be exported. Okay, so these are the slides from the AP, so let's go over them. Photosynthesis as a redox process. So remember, during cell respiration, the energy is released from sugar when the electrons associated with the hydrogen are transported by carriers to oxygen, forming water as a byproduct, right? The electrons will lose potential energy as they fall down, quote, fall down, the electron transport chain toward electronegative oxygen, and the mitochondrion will harness that energy to synthesize ATP. But photosynthesis reverses the direction of electron flow. And in photosynthesis, water is split and its electrons are transferred along with hydrogen ions from the water to carbon dioxide, reducing it to sugar. Okay, so because the electrons increase in potential energy as they move from water to sugar, this process requires energy, and so in other words, it's an endergonic process. Okay, so this energy boost that occurs during photosynthesis is provided by the light. All right, so it reverses the direction of electron flow, redox process in which water is oxidized, right here, so water is oxidized to become oxygen, and CO2 is reduced to become our sugars, and then as a whole, photosynthesis requires an energy boost in the form of sunlight, and so we would call that an endergonic process. Okay, so as a review, the 2 stages of photosynthesis, it consists of the light reactions, which is the photo part of the word photosynthesis, and it consists of the Calvin cycle, which is the synthesis part of photosynthesis. And the light reactions happen in the thylakoid. They split water, they release oxygen, they reduce NADP plus to NADPH, and they generate ATP from ADP by what we call photophosphorylation. And again, it uses the similar chemiosmotic mechanisms as the mitochondrion does. It's just this time oxygen is not our final electron acceptor. Instead, our final electron acceptor is NADP plus, and so when we generate the ATP, we call this process photophosphorylation because we need light energy rather than oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, and then the Calvin cycle in the stroma forms sugar from CO2 using the ATP and the NADPH that are created from the light-dependent reactions in the thylakoid. And, oh shoot. Sorry. And then the Calvin cycle begins with carbon fixation, incorporating carbon dioxide molecules into organic molecules. And so again, here is our overview diagram of the light-dependent reactions and then the light-independent reactions. Okay, and we will stop there.